Um, hi everyone, welcome to a rather special ECREA event on the information war and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. When I was growing up, one of the things that I remember reading was that if you ever saw someone throw a brick through the window of a Jewish person's house, the worst thing you could possibly do was to write a book about it. Nevertheless, I became an academic, but it was with some trepidation that ECREA decided to organise this event. But in our correspondence with Ukrainian scholars over the last couple of weeks or so, without exception, they've all mentioned the need to continue to do research and to engage in the public sphere as public intellectuals. And it's in that spirit that we've organised this event. Of course, we can do a lot more as academics, both individually and institutionally, and to offer material support to our Ukrainian colleagues. And I would urge all ECREA members to consider the ways in which they can do this. Okay, so today we're going to have essentially a roundtable event. We have 5 fantastic speakers. I'm very grateful for taking the decision to present today. They'll each talk for about 10 minutes each, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers. This is a webinar format, which means that you can type in your questions at the bottom of your screen, and the speakers can see your questions and comments as they proceed. But what we're going to do is take all of the questions after the 5th speaker, so that make sure that everyone gets an opportunity to say what they wanted to say. Without further ado, I'd like to start off with Precious Chatterje-Doody, who is a lecturer at the Open University in the UK and has recently completed a research project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council on Russia's projection of soft power, and I believe that Precious is primarily going to talk to us today about Russia today. So over to you, Precious. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, John. So yes, I am going to talk a little bit about Russian domestic coverage, but mainly as a counterpoint to international coverage of the invasion. And my main focus is on RT, because I think the war represents a very key turning point in how Russia can approach its overseas communications. It's been a real kind of rupturing point, and I'll discuss the reasons for that in a moment. Now, given that this event title is about the information war, which is a term that generally speaking I don't particularly like, but it's very appropriate at the moment, because not only are we seeing a physical war taking place, but we are very much seeing a conflict over how that war is portrayed on media, and the two sides attempting to I guess garner support. And ultimately what we've seen, I think, from an international perspective, is that Russia is very much losing the information war on a number of fronts. So I'm going to talk about kind of how RT's attempted to portray this invasion and the kind of fallout that we're seeing and what that means more generally. So just to begin with, I'll say that if you look at RT's outputs over a long term, you'll find that it's often talked about as being pro-Russian propaganda, but actually it's a little bit of a more nuanced picture than that most of the time, not at the moment, clearly. So its standard mode of operation in ordinary times is basically reporting that accords with Kremlin priorities from a Kremlin perspective, but is not openly unfair or misleading. Now, that consistently changes when Russia is on a war footing. So we saw it in the Georgian conflict, we saw it in the annexation of Crimea, we saw it with the poisoning of the Skripals in the UK in 2018, and we're seeing it now as well. I think it's important to recognise that, because that's how RT has managed to keep on operating for so long, because it manages to kind of combine this very biased representation of things that are of key national interest to Russia with something that more carefully skirts the outlines of media regulation the rest of the time. And that's quite important for understanding that strategy, and I'll come back to that a little later on as well. So before the actual invasion took place, on RT there were pretty much blanket denials of an imminent invasion, and reports of an imminent invasion were basically being painted as Russophobia or Western warmongering. And this fitted in with a very long tradition on RT of basically portraying any Western criticism as being Russophobia. And again, we saw a very similar tactic employed with the Skripal poisonings, where RT didn't actually report the fact that the poisonings had taken place in the beginning. It reported how the poisonings were being reported in Western media, and the standard line at that point was very much about how Western politicians and media rushed to judgment without any kind of evidence. And that was the very standard cookie cutter approach that was taken before the invasion. You know, Western media and politicians are rushing to judge that Russia is going to do something aggressive in Ukraine, but there's no real evidence for that. Now, obviously that's nonsense, but that was how they played it before the invasion took place. And once the invasion was underway, RT very much parroted Kremlin framing. So it used the language of special operation. It tried to underline that there was a legal basis for intervention by parroting the Kremlin claim about genocide in Donetsk and Luhansk, and by really emphasizing that there had been an official request from the leadership of the separatist regions for Russian involvement. And again, this very much fits in with a pattern on RT. It's how they justified Russian involvement in Syria, that this was at the behest of Syrian authorities. So there's a real attempt to kind of portray involvement as being legally valid and morally valid. And again, all those key Kremlin talking points about demilitarization, denazification, they were very much the bedrock of RT's coverage, as well as this idea that the Ukrainian people will decide what comes next. After this supposed demilitarization and denazification have happened, then the Ukrainian people will decide what comes next. Now, obviously, that's a massive logical contradiction, because the Ukrainian people decided what they wanted. They've had their free and fair elections, and it's Russia that's undermining them now. But obviously that's not really gone into at all on RT. There's a very clear line that attempts to kind of uphold Kremlin reasoning. And in a way, this was a sort of, it was a sort of lighter copy of Russian domestic coverage, where they had all of those kind of above reasons, plus more, you know, the idea that Ukraine's not even a real country, Zelensky's not a real president, and Russian involvement is very much a last resort, because it's been a necessary culmination of various negative social trends in Ukraine since 2014. And so RT kind of took its cue, I guess, from Russian domestic coverage, but tried to hedge it slightly more to be palatable to international audiences. Importantly, unsuccessfully, which I'll talk about a little more in a moment. And as well as this kind of ongoing news coverage, RT bulked out its coverage with various features. So these would include documentaries that had been shot in the separatist regions over the past few years, but which very much focused on pro-Russian families' experiences, or the experiences of pro-Russian actors or activists, I guess, special interviews with them, for example, and very much giving supposedly, you know, an unheard perspective, which is RT's branding. It's his branded intention, but it was always very much from this pro-Kremlin perspective. And again, we saw this backed up in all of RT's talk shows, where the sort of supposedly in-depth analysis of the circumstances around the war have focused on the idea of the war as a proxy conflict that signifies the collapse of the liberal order, or some sort of Western targeting of Russia and then indirectly China. and a focus on the conflicting media narratives, which I think is interesting and again speaks to RT's obsession with supposed Russophobia and the way in which Russia is represented, because, you know, there's been discussion on RT's talk shows about how Western media coverage is very different to the kind of coverage you would be seeing on RT. But the implication is that that's because it's highly politicized, and that it's, you know, born of Russophobia. And still, even in these representations, there's this very clear reliance on the Kremlin framing. So one of the talk shows had as its blurb, Russia's special military operation in Ukraine continues. This is widely agreed upon. Beyond that, media reporting could not be more polarized and politicized. So it's almost setting up as a given, something that is not in fact a given, that this is a special operation. And so it creates the appearance that there is more debate about what's going on than there in fact is on RT. So it's almost like a simulacrum of a discussion, I suppose, and that's something that RT has done consistently over time, is pick parts of controversial issues that it's capable of dealing with without actually going into any in-depth engagement with that. Certainly no in-depth engagement with the criticisms of Russia or with the charges that this is, you know, a full-scale invasion rather than a special operation. In response to the invasion and in response to the way in which Russian international media has attempted to cover it, we have seen an unprecedented level of joint action at the political level. So in the UK, we saw various politicians calling for RT to be at the very least inspected and at the most banned. Now that in itself is not unusual, because every time there is a crisis point, like with the Skripal poisonings, for example, we hear these calls. But the Culture Secretary wrote quite a high-profile letter to the media regulator Ofcom and received a public response, basically suggesting that RT should be investigated, to which Ofcom replied, well, we are in fact investigating already. Ofcom opened 15 investigations at the end of February, which is the biggest number of simultaneous investigations it's ever opened into RT, and then followed them up with 12 more very shortly afterwards at the start of March. So it's very clear that there is a lot of monitoring going on. At the same sort of time, we saw the EU ban RT across its territories. Now, this has had quite important knock-on effects, because it's basically meant that RT can't be received anymore by satellite in the UK because of the satellite signals coming through France. And RT is challenging this ban at the moment in the courts. That's something that RT does very often. So the last time RT was handed a substantial fine by Ofcom in the UK, again, it took it to the High Court and attempted to have that overturned, but it was upheld. RT does try and use the administrative capabilities that it can to maintain some sort of facade of legitimacy, I suppose, and I expect that's going to continue. You know, this ban will be challenged until it's either upheld or overturned. But what it's meant in practice is that all of RT's various language services are now essentially unavailable across the EU, and much more difficult to access in the UK as well. So you can at the moment still access RT's website, but you have to go there directly. Now, given that most of RT's traffic came via YouTube, that's a big loss, I think, to the network, because YouTube has also basically banned RT from broadcasting on there, I think because of the high level of political pressure. We've also seen various other fallouts in terms of the other operations. So RT America has now announced it's ceasing production, and there have been mass permanent staff layoffs. RT's creative division as well has been subject to layoffs. Various members of staff from both RT and Ripley, the video service, have essentially resigned in protest at the invasion. But what I think is really important to consider at the moment is that, apart from this galvanized political will, it's quite clear that audiences are not on board with RT. You know, it's still functioning in a kind of skeleton form through its website and through Twitter, for example, promoting that content. And by and large, audience reactions to RT's framing of this conflict have been extremely negative. And again, this mirrors exactly what happened with the Skripal conflict, where RT put out a really obscenely misleading line about it. You know, was an active part of the Kremlin's disinformation operation about that, and audiences didn't buy it at all. So often, you know, we worry so much about how RT represents things and what kind of influence it has, but audiences really have been very skeptical about that in the past at crucial moments and at the moment as well. So just to wrap up, I guess, I maybe think about, you know, where can RT or where can Russia's international communication operation go from here? I mean, I think this is a massive turning point for RT, of course, because it's been delegitimized at such a wide level. In many ways, it's used the furore about its operations as part of its branding in the past and almost as a way to brand itself to kind of gain support. I don't think that's very tenable at the moment, even if the EU ban, for example, were to be overturned. I think it's very difficult to see how RT as an institution come back from this. So I think we need to start thinking about the attendant informational outlets. Obviously, Sputnik and RT and their subsidiaries have been banned in the EU, but they're part of quite a well-documented wider Russian information ecosystem in which there are kind of directly linked media organizations, but also proxy organizations. And I think that's maybe where we need to focus our attention next, as to where the next attempts at impact will be coming from, certainly in the medium term, I guess. But I think overall, you know, if you look at how badly Russia's international communication effort around this conflict has gone down, especially compared with how well Ukraine has managed to communicate about this with quite personalized, open communication. I think from the Russian side, this is going to demand a really wholesale communications rethink, and it's quite clear that they've not achieved their communication objectives around the war at all.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Precious. So our next speaker is Tanya Lokot from Dublin City University, where she's an associate professor. Tanya's written a recent book called Beyond the Protest Square, which is about the use of digital media in protests in the Ukraine and in Russia. So Tanya, please.
Thanks, John, and thanks, Precious. I think my bit will segue quite nicely from Precious' reflections on Russian media and their attempts to frame the situation and frame the special operation, as they're calling it. I'd like to actually talk about the Ukrainian side and to talk about some of the efforts we're seeing on the Ukrainian side to control the information space, which is obviously a really important part of Ukraine's defenses against Russia's attack. You know, again, I would also agree with Precious that just talking about an information war is no longer enough. We are talking about a war on all fronts, and the information space is an inseparable part of that war. And I think it's been really heartening to see that the Ukrainian side, including government officials, including civil society, including the media in Ukraine, independent media, they all understand this really well. And that from the very, well, first of all, because, you know, they've been involved in a standoff and a conflict with Russia since at least 2014. So we've learned a lot. On the other hand, they've very quickly understood that they needed to take the initiative, and that it, you know, it wasn't enough to just wait for RT or whoever to make pronouncements about the situation and then to debunk them, but that it was important to have things to fill the information space with, so that it wouldn't be left as a vacuum or as an empty space, which could be filled with disinformation and erroneous framings. So I think there are several aspects here that are worth paying attention to. First of all, it's how cohesive and seemingly coordinated, but at the very least, you know, the efforts have been on the part of government officials, different ministries, the president's office, then on the part of independent media operating in Ukraine, and on the part of civil society and various grassroots networks and just individual citizens, how coordinated these efforts have been, and how there is a very cohesive understanding of what are some of the key aspects that they need to be working on. So obviously, you know, there's been a lot of, I think, a lot of the media requests I got this week were about, can we talk about Zelensky and how great he is, and, you know, in terms of like his command of the information space. But I think, you know, it's obviously not just Zelensky. You know, he's a personality, and he's certainly been a very good at drawing attention on himself. But it's obvious that there is a team, and that there is a very clear strategic effort at putting out information, making it regular, making it fact-based and evidence-based, but also appealing to people's emotions, right? Because this is a crisis. We are indeed in a situation where we need facts and we need evidence for whatever statements are being made. And that is very important in order to oppose the absolute wall of lies and, you know, misrepresentations that are coming in from the Russian side. But facts and evidence are necessary, but we are also in a war where you can't share all the facts and all the evidence. So you also have to be measured, and you have to be strategic about what you release, who you share it with, who you aim particular bits of information at. So I think they've been very strategic about what facts they do release. But certainly, you know, it's clear that there is a lot of information coming from the Ukrainian side, and that information is aimed at Ukrainians who need information sometimes in order to survive, or, you know, in order to help defend their country. Also, information is aimed at the Russian population, because obviously, you know, this is also, as Precious has talked about, and as I'm sure Joanna will talk about, there's also a channel here where the Ukrainian side is trying to speak to Russian citizens, and, you know, including soldiers' mothers, but also just ordinary Russian media users, to explain to them what is actually happening, to break through that wall of misinformation. But they're also addressing international audiences, right? Again, in order to frame the war as a war, and as a war of aggression on the part of Russia, who, you know, impinging on Ukrainian territory, impinging on Ukraine's sovereignty. So the framing of the events of the past few weeks and of the past 8 years is very important. And it's very important to take control of the framing, because it then allows Ukraine to make additional arguments, to ask for help, to ask for solidarity, to ask for humanitarian interventions, and all of those other things. So framing is one thing. I think the other thing the Ukrainian side has been good at all levels is pre-bunking, right? Which there's this big discussion about, well, how helpful is debunking misinformation? It's only so helpful, especially when there's so much of it. So actually pre-bunking, right? And it's saying, well, we expect that there will be fakes about X, Y, and Z. We expect that the Russians will keep saying every day that Zelensky's escaped and that he's no longer in Kiev. So we know this is going to happen, right? The Ukrainian side is at this point very experienced in understanding what kinds of misinformation will be shared. So they are doing everything they can to use those opportunities to actually say, well, we know this is going to happen, and we can tell you already that this is not going to be true, or that this information is distorted. So pre-bunking is very important. I think what was really important to me is also that at both the very grassroots citizen level and at the state official level, the role of emotion has also been given a prominent place. Because, you know, facts and evidence are important, but telling people's stories and sharing real grief and real trauma on the ground is incredibly important. Obviously, the journalists, and especially the Ukrainian journalists, have played an incredibly important part in this, because they've been doing this very, very brave work. And yes, there is a number of foreign media outlets operating on the ground, but very often it's the local journalists, and especially those of them who are, you know, bi or trilingual, who are best placed to tell these stories, because not only do they speak the languages, but they also understand the local context, and they can provide additional context for personal stories and place them in the greater narrative and the greater kind of fabric of the war and of the everyday suffering and trauma of the people. Individuals themselves, you know, people, obviously, as somebody said on Twitter, it was very unfortunate for Russia to attack a country where everybody has a smartphone and everybody is taking photos and videos of everything that's happening. I think that's incredibly important. And also that the citizens understand that they have these tools at their disposal to tell stories, but that also these tools are dual use technologies, that it's important to be discerning in terms of what information you share and what information maybe you don't share or don't share in real time, because it also, endangers the actual kind of run of the conflict. The other thing in terms of emotion is the role of language. Obviously, language has been made especially by the pro-Russian and Russian side, into a contentious issue, in terms of like, are you Russian speaking or are you Ukrainian speaking? And again, Ukrainians have been using this kind of opportunity to explain that language, in terms of like what language you speak, has nothing to do with your political affiliation or with your sympathies. And we've seen a huge number of examples shared on social media of Russian speakers, in cities like Kherson or Mykolaiv or Mariupol, coming out to protest against the Russian occupying forces, speaking Russian, cursing them out in Russian, etc. So I think that's, again, very important, because it really breaks through those myths that the Russian side has tried for so long to seed, that just because they're Russian speakers means they are in essence Russians, and therefore they are ours and we must protect them. And I think in general, the attention paid to language, there have been a couple of really good examples where Ukrainian outlets and organizations have tried to introduce these corrective interventions, saying, let's pay attention to language. Don't call this a situation or a military operation. It is a war, and it is a war by Russia on Ukraine, etc. So introducing those corrections, I think, is incredibly important. And then seeing grassroots efforts where people, comment under reports by international media, correcting the language they use, because they understand that language is very important. So whether they're talking about the events of the war on the ground, or they're talking about the refugees fleeing Ukraine, or, internally displaced people, seeing those correctives in real time, I think, has been really powerful. And together with the emotional stories and with the evidence and the fact-based interventions, I think it's created a really good sense that Ukraine is indeed controlling the information space. It is, of course, a really difficult information space, because it's not just the public stuff that we see on Facebook pages and YouTube videos and Twitter, but it's also the more dark and closed space of messengers such as Telegram, WhatsApp, and Viber, where a lot of those things are less visible, but they are nonetheless incredibly important. So there's been a huge explosion in the number of different channels coordinating different kinds of humanitarian aid, coordinating fundraising efforts. And then out of those channels, that information is then shared strategically with different audiences, depending on, if people are fundraising to support local defense forces, or if they're fundraising to support academics and students, or any of the other audiences. So I think it shows that in Ukraine, there is a growing sense that people understand the way these tools of information are to be used. That tradition obviously is not something that just appeared overnight. We had the Orange Revolution, we had all the civic organizing before that, and after that we had the Euromaidan and Revolution of Dignity, and then since 2014, the occupation of Crimea and the occupation of parts of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts in eastern Ukraine. So all of those networks, all of that experience, all of that civic civic expertise is now serving the Ukrainian society in really, really good stead. Like it's providing the knowledge that is now being shared with many more people who are also becoming parts of these networks. And it's creating opportunities for framing the war, for framing the roles that different countries should or can play in the war, and different actors. And it's also showing that despite differences and despite past opinions, there are some very clear things on which government officials, media outlets and media professionals, companies working in Ukraine, and Ukrainian citizens are all agreeing on, right? So there is a common vocabulary, there is a common grammar, or how we talk about the war. And I think it's incredibly important that, yes, there's a diversity of stories, but at the same time, there are clear common themes and clear approaches that are also common, those of transparency, those of you know, showing restraint, but also not being afraid to tell things as they really are, and understanding the importance of showing the impact of the war on the lives of real people on the ground. I'll stop there and pass it over to the next speaker.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Tanya. So our next speaker is Lyubov Naydonova, who's the director of the Institute for Social and Political Psychology in Kyiv. She is also an ECREA member and president of the Ukrainian Media Psychologists Association. Lyubov is joining us from Poland, where she's currently a refugee. So thank you, Lyubov, for joining us.
Thank you very much for invitation for this very important talking about the information part of the war, which is in Ukraine just now. And I want to set some thoughts that maybe will more radical for you, more radical than we want, but it is about Russia as a country which are not country aggressor, but country terrorist and liar. I just now have some slides, and the first part of my talking was about the real situation in Ukraine, and I using some source just now. Do you think? Okay, this is the small video from our agency, informational agency, Ukrinform, that you know, it is a public media. It is made from the real video from people who sent on the chatbot which was created at the first day. And this is the real, it is the reality of our small town near the Kiev. They are destroyed. It is 4 of March, but just now all buildings of all houses are destroyed, more or less, and people who live in under the building are blocked. And just now, for example, women who born the small children under the blocking. It is terrible. But this small video represents this reality. And we have one small video which is created for people in other countries, from Minister of Culture and Information Policy of Ukraine, Tkachenko, who represent the reality with children and arguments the need of closed the sky and organized no-fly zone in Ukraine. And next slide is the reality of my colleagues, my friends, Vika Kurilenko, which lives in Bucha. You see the map. This is Kiev, and Bucha is this very near the Kiev, and all town around the Kiev are destroyed. And she is escaped from Bucha just now. She is in safety, but other people are still in Bucha. And only today morning was created the green way for evacuation, but I don't know information about this because in Mariupol, for example, the Green Way was used by Russian military to attack the city, because I don't know about this situation, but Vika is safety. And the next, from my colleagues, information on the Telegram channel Truth About War in Ukraine by Russian language, Pravda о войне, we're gathering the information. It's my colleague make it. He gathering the information from different social media and give the true information about the war. And today morning we have information about killing the girl by this Green Way, by attack through this Green Way. And because I want to say about the ethical part of informational war, and some idea about this is about the Russia as a terrorist country for their own people at first. Russia has been waging an information war against its own population for several generations. Russia immersing people in alternative reality. It is the informational psychological technology, and we are media psychology is the part of this technology. But just now we see the result of this technology. This is falsified history and current events too, and using terrorist information psychological operation against children, because at 4 days earlier they have all Russian class for children about the operation in Ukraine. Narrative construction proposed the ban to ban the word war. War is not reality. Reality named by demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. It is not war. It is a small operation, and it is the falsified of reality. It is very important because it frames the mind of the children, and it is the terrorist attack against children in Russia. And moral disaster of Russian intellectual community we have just now, because we have address of Russian Union of Rectors. More than 700 rectors of Russian university sign this call, this address. And I don't read the text, but this is about demilitarization and denazification, about support of country and army, about external enemy. And I propose to read it later because the Russian Union of Rectors don't give this text in English on their site only in Russia, because information for inner using is very, very different from information to other country in Russia. We must to understand this. And some psychological thoughts about Russia and Russian society, which are, the people are sick. It is a social psychological pathology. We proposed to see on this event from this point of view. Sanctions are needed not only as punishment for terrorism, but for treat the pathology of social mass consciousness. Part of a terrorist attack against the people from Russia is a paralyzing wave of fear. By constructing the image of an external enemy, and just now external enemy is Ukraine, which create the nuclear bomb, which create the chemical bomb, which create pathogen for biological attack of Russia, and so on, which is lie all. Constructing an image of the situation of constant surveillance and for people, and image of punishment for non-compliance with the declared correct opinion. It is really because when you go through street, walk by street, the police can stop you and pick up your phone and see in phone your communication in messenger, and war is a criminal. The word war is a criminal, because we have information about such event. The court opens case against a girl who rode by step in snow, no war. And it is the criminal for Russia. It may be funny, so wild, but it is reality in Russia. We don't feel it and we don't understand it, but it is the sick society, because they under the trauma, under the media trauma from own country. And this hopelessness of constant fear compensated by hysterical enthusiasm of reckless aggression. And this is psychological mechanism which we think about. And I want to tell about, because it may be used when we construct some information message to Russian people, because they are in the closed mind and don't see other information which non-consist of their technologically created image of the reality. And last slide with this maybe radical proposition. Don't believe the lies of Russia, because Europe does not have time for ambiguity just now, as I think, because war rages not now in Ukraine only, and next external enemy may be other European countries, and Russian military take control under Ukrainian nuclear plant in Chernobyl, and they attack in Zaporizhzhia in a direct way to kept Energodar. It is the second more power nuclear station than Chernobyl, more power. The attack is continuous. But I ask you understand that some information about the attack and about the events is not open just now, because our military minister asked, don't give information about the destroyed house in real time. Give that delay, because this information may be used for correct the next attack. And because we have some delay of information about the reality in Ukraine, you can understand that it is something against the free of media, maybe, but it is very needed just now. And the war began in 2014. I see you say that, you understand that, but we have some ambiguity of our thinking and our concept when we ask Nazism or nationalism are in Ukraine. Ukraine is fighting against itself in Donbass or Russia. Russia is saving Russian speakers from genocide or simple killing our children. We don't have the time for this ambiguity just now, because it is the part of informational war, of Russian informational war against Europe and other civilian countries. I hope my thoughts may be useful for communicator in Europe and some source of media and social media can be used for taking the information from first hand in Ukraine. Thank you very much for your attention.
And thank you.
And thank you very much for all people in Europe, in Poland, in Czech Republic, in Romania and other countries who help Ukrainian refugees just now. It's really, really needed. And we feel solidarity very, very high, and want to say thanks very, very much.
Thank you, Lyubov. Before moving on to our fourth speaker, I'd just like to remind participants that if you'd like to ask a question, you can type it into the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will get round, I hope, to all of the questions after the speakers have spoken. So 4 speakers: Joanna Szostek from University of Glasgow. Joanna's studied, written about competing political narratives in Ukraine for a number of years, doing fieldwork in Kiev again, and I think she'll also be talking about some Russian data as well. So Joanna, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, John. Thank you for the invitation to speak here. Thank you especially for Ukrainian colleagues on the panel, particularly Lyubov. I can't imagine how difficult it must be to speak at the moment, because I get emotional, and I'm not Ukrainian, but I lived there for 18 months, and yeah, it's really, really hard to talk at the moment. But yeah, we do our best. So I guess I'll use my 10 minutes to kind of reiterate some of the things that Lyubov was saying, perhaps add a little bit about how the Russian leadership so utterly misunderstood Ukraine and Ukrainians and the nature of public opinion in Ukraine. But first, Russia, because probably the question I'm asked most by journalists in the past week is, what are the Russian media reporting? What are they saying? How are they seeing this in Russia? And on some of these issues, some of the things that are in the Russian media have been widely reported. So I guess you're probably aware, in Russia, there is no war, right? It's a military operation. It's a special operation. The word war is pretty much outlawed. Other things that are constantly repeated, if there are any atrocities, if there are any civilian deaths, that's all Ukrainians shooting themselves, right? Of course, it's not Russian. If there are sanctions, that's the West sanctioning themselves, because the West will obviously suffer from these sanctions more than Russia will. That's what the TV is repeating in Russia. At every level, there are lies. Even the exchange rate, right? I was watching the ruble dollar exchange rate on TASS, on all the main Russian state websites was, they were saying 105 rubles to the dollar when it was actually 150. I mean, at every level there are lies. But I think what's struck me, I try to check Russian news sources each day just to kind of get an impression of what they're saying. And it's not just the absence of truth, it's the absence of humanity. Just watching them kind of dehumanize people in a neighboring state, and sort of, this rhetoric about Nazis, and that they can use that to do what they're doing. And I think also, it's not just the narratives, it's the lack of images. So if you kind of look across, websites, the most popular news websites in Russia, you just don't see the images of casualties, the images of civilians escaping under fire, the buildings that are being destroyed, everything that we're seeing through, the BBC, through the Guardian, through whichever Western sources you see these images that are sort of tearing our hearts apart. I mean, most Russians, if they limit themselves just to the state media, they kind of miss that. Or if they see it, it'll again be blamed on the Ukrainians. So yeah, lack of truth, lack of humanity. I guess another question that comes up is, how can Russians buy this, right? When will the penny drop? And Lyubov spoke, powerfully about that, how they've been kind of, you almost need a psychological operation to save them from themselves. I mean, when I've been asked about this is, through kind of years of researching audiences in this part of the world. There's a lot of ignorance, political ignorance, which stems a lot from apathy. The sense that Russians have tuned out of politics for years because they don't feel that, they can really change anything. So why really bother paying much attention? Why really bother paying much attention to what their leadership has become? Of course, it's difficult in some ways because, past few years, the numbers of alternative sources of information have really been shrinking. I mean, there were some up until 2 weeks ago. You could, if you looked on the Russian internet, find sources of good Russian independent journalism. They had small audiences, but they were there. Now they've obviously been shut down, cleared, banned, blocked. I think now, if information does get through, it'll be through, perhaps social media more. Telegram, I think you can perhaps still find things. English language media, I think, if Tanya may correct me, but I think you can kind of still, if people speak English over there, they can probably still find English language media that are accessible. And there is, I mean, the one new Russian news source that's given me a sort of glimpse of integrity is Kommersant, the big Russian broadsheet, which has been sort of trying to convey a bit of truth about what's happening. So there's a lack of choice is part of the explanation, but also nationalism. I mean, I almost put that as reason number one for why Russians are believing this whilst the rest of the world looks on in horror, is that all these narratives are rooted in the idea that Russia is saving Ukraine from Nazis, which to anyone outside of Russia would look like complete nonsense. But, this is this is why the sort of approach to teaching history in Russia is so important, because they're constantly told that their country is always the hero historically, right? And so obviously, how could you believe that Russia was, you know, bombing a neighboring country that didn't deserve it? You know, for Russians, that's not going to make, for a lot of Russians, and that's not going to make sense. So they're living in a kind of alternative reality, many of them. Not everybody, you know, there's a minority who are brave, who are looking for real information and who are protesting, but it's still a minority. When will the majority catch on, I guess, is, you know, the big question now. Can we kind of implode that alternative reality that the Russian state media have created? It's a really, I struggle to answer that question. I think the economic sanctions will, you know, get through to some degree, you know, because I remember doing interviews and people say that they don't believe any of the media reports because everybody lies, but they believe the exchange rate, right? Because that's something tangible. They believe prices in the shops. To what extent that will really push them into accepting what their leadership is doing, I don't know, but yeah, I think it's necessary. But yeah, it's the challenge is how to basically kind of move millions of Russians out of a very false, comfortable reality where their country is doing good things into the real world where their country is doing horrific things, and trying to kind of make that shift is going to be very, very difficult. John, how much time have I spoken for? How much time have I got left?
You've got a few minutes, Joanna.
Okay, in that case, I'll talk very briefly about the idea of pro-Russians in Ukraine, right? Pro-Russian sentiment in Ukraine, because that's something I've been working on in research for the past few years, is kind of trying to understand Ukrainian audiences, because there was always this fear that, you know, Russian propaganda is powerful in Ukraine. Russian disinformation is subverting Ukraine and this kind of thing. And, you know, there were most concern about Russian-speaking audiences in certain parts of the country, in the south and the east, who are sort of susceptible to Russian disinformation and Russian propaganda. And I've conducted focus groups and I've conducted surveys in places like Odessa region, in places like Sumy region, you know, parts of Russia that are traditionally, parts of Ukraine that are traditionally Russian speaking, and come out in surveys as sort of relatively pro-Russian. But what did it mean to be a pro-Russian in Ukraine? It meant, you know, having kind of a fondness for Russian culture, not wanting to see Russia as the enemy. It meant, you know, perhaps not being that keen on NATO membership. It meant perhaps, you know, not wanting to be in a kind of at odds with the Russian Orthodox Church. It meant perhaps, you know, wanting more freedom to use Russian language in sort of school settings, perhaps, things like that. But the thing is, all those people that would kind of answer surveys in the way that you might say was a little bit pro-Russian, they were still Ukrainians. They were still proud to be Ukrainians. And I think that's what the Russian leadership has so fundamentally misunderstood. You know, the fact that, you know, you can't try to bomb a country out of existence and break it up and then think that people who are part of that political community are somehow going to accept that. I mean, it almost seems too obvious to say, and yet I think, you know, the Russian leadership, that seems to have been their basis for launching this operation, is that, you know, somehow the pro-Russian people in Ukraine will be glad to welcome them whilst their homes are being bombed and, you know, their families are fleeing for their lives. So yeah, I think but this misunderstanding of what it meant to be a sort of relatively pro-Russian Ukrainian has been misunderstood widely, you know, in Russia, but also in the West. You know, this tendency for Western media to present Ukraine as split between, you know, Russian-speaking East and Ukrainian-speaking West. I mean, it's so much more complicated than that. And yeah, anyway, I'll stop there. I didn't prepare that terribly well because life's been busy, but yeah, those are my thoughts.
Thanks very much, Joanna. And our final speaker is Elisabeth Schimpfoessl from Aston University, where she's a senior lecturer. Elisabeth, written a book that came out with Oxford University Press, I think 2018, on Russian oligarchs, and more recently has written about self-censorship in Russian media. So, Elisabeth, thank you very much for joining us.
And thank you for having me. I'd like to touch upon 3 points. The first one is taking us out of the region entirely, and that is the West and its choice of terminology and definitions, which I believe has quite some severe impact in many ways. And that is the one thing I want to talk about is that basically in the last 2.5 weeks, world leaders have redefined the term oligarch. 2.5 weeks ago, they wouldn't have called the typical Putin crony the profiteer who grew rich, being basically the flesh and blood of Putin, formerly, or thanks to the friendship, the long-standing one they've had with him. They wouldn't have called them oligarchs. Johnson was annoying me most of all right from the start when yesterday, 2 weeks ago, he announced the first individual sanctions, of course, calling them oligarchs. And on the list were the 2 Rothenbergs, Boris and Igor, and Timchenko. Non-sanctions, pretty much, sorry my expression, a little bit of piss-taking, because none of the 3 has any interest, is any active in the UK. Yes, of course, the Rothenbergs might be losing a few flats, but that's, they will not bother too much about that. In contrast, those who hang around here, what we understood as oligarchs up until 2.5 weeks ago, they have been left pretty unscathed. I did a count. If we look at the various lists, there are 2 oligarchs on the UK's individual sanction list. There are 8 in the US and 5 on the EU sanction list. The EU was first, then can get credit for that, but there is obviously a very great reluctance to take them to responsibility, which would have, I believe, much more impact if they were sanctioned than the kinds of the likes of Prigozhin or Rothenberg, who never expected to be welcomed by the West with greatest enthusiasm anyway, and who will also be hit much less because they're not losing. It's not so much when you can lose if you lose your yacht. It's unpleasant and takes ages. There's such long queues to get a new yacht built. But if you have billions, well, it's not the end of the world. What for the oligarchs hanging around here is extremely bitter is to lose access to the whole world, to lose the opportunity to get onto their private jets and fly wherever they want the next day. And most painfully, the social standing and status many of them have put so much efforts into over years to be accepted part of Western elites. Yeah, and that's obviously a good reason of why they've been unscathed. They are just too welcome here and bring so much money, and the money is, of course, not something Western countries, certain industries, it's not of any benefit for us in the UK, but of course for the UK establishment, it's not something they want to see not flowing anymore. And so that's the first point, and it brings also, I said Prigozhin before, I am part of a project. The main researcher working in it is on this Zoom call. It's Sergei Polyakov in Passau, and with him we are looking at troll factories. And so far we want to know of how they work in detail, the internal processes, practices, and also what people think, what the kind of also just basically what kind of people get recruited, how that works, and how then informal hierarchies, pecking orders play out. And we did an interview, Sergei and I, some months ago, with one former troll factory worker And he told us something I wasn't aware about at all. He said that it's organized in a way that there's basically the upper echelon of the troll factories, the thinkers and analytics who work out certain fake news narratives and then pass them on to the brigadiers, who then instruct the shop floor workers, the assembly line workers in troll factories to carry out, to write certain stories or run certain social media platforms or tweets or commentary. And what he said was what I found very interesting. It's not that the people on the shop floor have any much awareness of that it's all made up stuff. So it's also meant the whole process that once it comes to the brigadier, it's already something that the assembly line workers are meant to fully believe in. And that has also worked throughout the years. There was just one case, which this former troll factory talked about, when there was this big fire in the shopping center in Kemerovo in 2018. That was also presented. They were meant to talk about that there's just Western propaganda. And that was harsh for especially the females and especially those who had children, who were just seeing that children were dying in great numbers and couldn't quite bring themselves to digest the approach they were instructed to take. Would be very interesting. I think it's now very important to, Sergey, we need to find current troll factory workers. I haven't followed it very closely, but one peculiar thing I found was their approach to how they present Ukrainian industrially produced fake news, excusing Ukraine of having arranged massive troll factories. So basically they describe themselves and then take what they do and apply to Ukraine with all kind of oligarchs financing and sponsoring the work, and also of course foreign sponsors, George Soros as always, but funnily enough also the Habsburgs are among the financiers of that procedure. A last point I wanted to briefly talk about, we've seen now independent news outlets basically having vanished. What they did the first days was to try to sneak around. So as I understand, most of the remaining independent news outlets tried to basically not to attract attention by complying to the instructions not to say war in any case, but replace it with strategic military operation and all these things. Didn't help, as we know, on the 3rd of March with the fake news law, the new one, they were pretty much done. Even Echo Moskvevich is quite curious because Benedictov has said many times that he will survive till the very end of as long as Putin is around, he'll be there too. And that is also a bit indicative. Benedictov is one of the many creatures who survived despite everything, but just because, or thanks to the strategies he employed, among them was a lot of schmoozing and mingling and socializing in elite circles, and of course also making compromises here and there and accommodates to certain demands and requirements coming from the Kremlin. And with Ilya Yablokov, we wrote a book proposal on media tycoons. And last month came to a certain idea that it's exactly this sneaking around these strategies, many of you might have heard me repeating this mantra, adequateness, that has allowed them to survive for that long, but at the same time it's also precisely what oils the machinery of Putin's authoritarianism. And as we can see now, on this constant compromising, this constant accommodating themselves with the regime, which for many years has allowed them a certain autonomy and leverage to run decent journalism. Now eventually it's kicked back, and so basically they were burying their own grave. For later on, just a question, I have, if others know about it, other panelists or anybody in the audience. I haven't read anything interesting about it, but it seems to me that big tech, well, I might have just missed it, that big tech around the world social media platform seems to have taken a curious approach. The other day I saw on Facebook a video that showed battlefields with corpses of Russian soldiers. If you think back to the approach during the pandemic, where the battle with misinformation often led to the most unrelated things to be censored, this seems to be something that goes very much a very, very different approach to what is deselected from the platform and what not. And another thing I'd like to hear if anybody has an opinion on that. I mean, I'm hugely fascinated by Ukrainians' information warfare, which of course I struggle to ever criticize them. Of course, it's hugely problematic to inflict on the Geneva Convention and show faces of Russian prisoners, soldiers. That's of course a problem, which of course could also backfire. But otherwise, there seems to be hugely, I don't know whether you've seen the Staria military, I don't know, commandeer or officer, and her very effectful video and other things. It seems to be a hugely fascinating and hugely sophisticated and refined approach to organized information warfare. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Elisabeth. So we have around about 45 minutes for questions and answers and comments. Just to remind everyone that you can type in a question to the in the Q&A box, and we'll try and get round to all of them. We've got a few questions open at the moment. I think the first one is about Western representations of the invasion, Western representations of the war. And there's a concern here that these Western representations might be glorifying the Ukrainian defense and therefore glorifying war itself. Is that something that the speakers have noticed? Is Western media glorifying it, or are there other representations going around? Would anyone like to answer that? Tanya?
Sure, I can start. I think it's definitely been a criticism that I've noted many people making, you know, that it seems to be like Ukraine's actions on the ground and whatever, either the Ukrainian governments or the courageous fight that the Ukrainians are putting up. It seems like it's, but I think it's you know, and perhaps that's how people see it, that, you know, it's a glorification of war. But I think here the framing is not that we're glorifying war. Ukrainians don't want war. They never asked for this war. But what they're doing is they're doing the best they can under these conditions to survive under the onslaught of Russian aggression. So, you know, the reason why Ukrainians are putting up a fight and why they're engaging in all these courageous acts, however large or small, is not because they're fans of war. It's because they want to survive. And obviously we can't dictate to the mainstream media, including foreign media, how they cover this or how they present this. But I think it's very important for the media to also get across that point, that, you know, Ukrainians are not fighting back because they enjoy whatever, stealing tanks and shooting at Russian soldiers. They're doing this because they're terrified that the very existence of their country is at stake. And that's the framing we should be aiming for, and not, you know, discussing whatever warmongering or NATO or whatnot. We should be talking about the lives of people on the ground and framing all of the heroic acts that Ukrainians are committing in that light, that it's, for them, it's not about glorification of war. For them, it's about survival, you know, and like the numbers and facts of all the lives that have already been lost and the many more lives that have been destroyed by either people getting hurt or by people fleeing, like that's what's at stake. It's not about the glorification of war. And if, you know, if the Western media aren't seeing it, or if they have a somewhat different framing, then perhaps it's worth reconsidering how exactly they're framing what's going on the ground and the war.
There's also been a lot of really very horrific images of civilian casualties from Ukraine as well. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts of.
Yeah, well, I think Lyubov wants to add something, and I'm sure like she could speak to this, because she's also showed us some of those images.
Mm-hmm. I agree with Tanya that glorification of the war is the bad. We make glorification of people who fight and who fight for saving their house and their children and their peaceful life. We do this glorification just now, and we do in future, because they are heroes, really. And it's my thinking about glorification. I have some idea about Russia-phobia. I want to send procedures when he said about Russia-phobia. I think about reconstruction this term at all, because maybe reframing the Russian disgustia, not phobia. We don't fear the Russia. We contempt the Russia. We disgust, and maybe in this direction. I don't know English so as you, for example, yeah, you decide what, but the only direction, yeah, for reconstruction, Russia-phobia, because we don't fear. And if I have talking just now, I said two things, two thoughts. The first is about the media in Ukraine. They are not media which was before war. We make many effort for self-regulation of media, for quality of media, but it is very tight work. But just now we have synergy of media from different oligarchs, because the journalists and media maker have own voice, and this is the synergy and joint voice. They integrated all company for some media messaging and media events. The self-regulation is rising very, very high just now. And the second and last, I think, we start just now our Institute of Social and Political Psychology in Ukraine with our partners in other countries, we start the project, volunteer project just now, for interviewing the refugee and fixation the information about their witness testimony for future, maybe court, maybe historical investigation or media research, but just now we must to fixate, and we ask the partner to, and some funds for this, for volunteers to make it, because we as psychologists help people, but during this communication we can make the fixation by right methods, this information for future.
Okay.
And I ask.
Thank you very much. I think then we've got a question, I guess, primarily for Precious, but perhaps for other panelists as well, about the extent to which Russian soft power operations are still active, particularly Russia today. There's a question saying that it's pretty active still in France, and there's not much sign of negative comments, and also while perhaps in most of Europe there's quite a groundswell of support for Ukraine, that's not necessarily the case in other parts of the world, and it may be that Russian soft power activities are resonating in some parts of Africa, for example. French-speaking Africa is referred to by this question. Precious, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's a really helpful question, actually. So thank you very much for raising the point. I think the first thing that it's important to say is that RT's different language services, as well as its different outputs across various platforms, have always been quite differentiated. And I was speaking primarily about the English language stuff intended for RT UK and RT America. Now, one of the key differences, I think, with RT France, which I'll admit I haven't looked at specifically in relation to the current war, but previously RT France has had, I would say, slightly less objectionable coverage in general, so slightly more balanced and more, I guess, higher quality outputs than generally speaking on the English language channels. I think that's partly in response to consistent pressure from the Macron administration. But even so, there's been various resignations from RT France and, you know, suspensions of involvement from quite high profile presenters because of the war. But the point you raise about French-speaking Africa and how well these media products are going down there is quite an important one, I think, because I guess my presentation was mainly sort of Eurocentric or Euro-Atlantic centric, partly because of, you know, this audience, but partly because that's where my research focus has been. But it's important, I think, to note that all along for RT, the broadcast hubs it has in Europe and in North America were very much seen as status symbols. You know, its actual broadcast operations, even from there, were never the main thing. It was always the online dissemination, and it was essentially just evidence that it was a big hitter to have those studios. Now, if you actually look at where audiences are more engaged with RT, you see that in South America, for example, RT's Spanish language service has been syndicated in many countries and is available as part of your standard kind of free network packages. And also in the Middle East, North Africa region, that's basically the only place where audiences of RT are growing relative to other providers. So that RT has an Arabic service, and its audiences are increasing quite a lot. So I think it's definitely a good point in terms of, you know, where does RT go next? I think its current model for certainly North America and Europe is not sustainable. Whether it's going to then shift the focus more to these other areas of the world, I think that's entirely possible. So yeah, but potentially what you're seeing is kind of an indication of one of the directions that the Russian information operations might move next.
Okay, thanks very much, Precious. Then we've got a question about how we as communications scholars and perhaps also citizens can vaccinate ourselves or inoculate ourselves against disinformation. I think what's really motivating this question is a fear of escalation of war, and that we might get carried along with a sort of somehow a momentum towards a bigger European or even a global conflict. You know, I think if anyone heard Zelensky's address to the House of Commons yesterday, where he invoked Churchill's famous speech about fighting in forests and fields and streets, incredibly powerful speech, but also with clear historical resonance to the Second World War. I think that might, to a certain extent, lie behind this question. I was just wondering who would like to have a go at answering that. Joanna? Or?
Yeah, I'll have a little go. Yeah, I mean, I think we all do have to be careful in the current context with what we share. You know, I know, you know, that the intensity of life on social media has suddenly kind of ratcheted up to kind of unprecedented levels, and it's, you know, that we're now having conversations with people that we perhaps haven't come across before in real life, and there's, yeah, it's easy for misinformation to be spread kind of involuntarily. I guess, you know, how, you know, things perhaps that are worth bearing in mind is to check who you're retweeting or reposting. You know, I know in the past week I've kind of read something that I thought, oh, that's interesting, I don't really know who this guy is, and I've, you know, retweeted it and then gone back and thought, actually, maybe I shouldn't have retweeted that. And remember, there's the unretweet button, right? If you share something, you can kind of undo that. And I've done that once or twice this week. I mean, in terms of the bigger picture, you know, though, you know, these kind of narratives that Russia's been pushing so long, the sort of anti-Western stuff, that what it's, you know, attempts to justify what it's doing in Ukraine, though, I think the Russian leadership, Putin, they lost that battle from the moment they launched this campaign. And I say that because, you know, what matters in terms of what people believe, it's not just a question of accuracy, it's a question of values. People don't just believe, you know, they don't just try to judge what's true and false in the media, they try to judge what's right and wrong in the media. And, you know, what Russia is doing now is so egregiously awful. You know, it violates, you know, the most fundamental principles of international politics in terms of, you know, not trying to take your neighboring state's territory or kill its people. I mean, I think therefore to kind of, yeah, I mean, that this is why you've seen backtracking even from the people, you know, countries in Europe, presidents in Europe that have traditionally been, you know, rather pro-Putin are suddenly edging away from that. So, I mean, I would say, in terms of getting the overarching Russian narrative of this conflict to be widely believed, that's mission impossible for them. What we need to be careful of, though, is kind of the untruths from either side, misinformation from either side, and just kind of be wary of what we share and what we take at face value.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Next question is really about our discipline, and I guess a lot of people in the field, including myself, have to say, were very shocked by the invasion, and the question from the floor is, how can we miss this as a field? Because the question from the floor is suggesting that really this has been going on at least since 2014 and possibly from 2008, and it's just something that we've missed, and we shouldn't really be shocked by this. It's just an extension of what has been happening for over a decade. So if we did miss this, what can we do in the future not miss it, and what should we be doing now? You know, in terms of research, what research should we be doing to make sure we don't get it so wrong in the future? Who would like to have a go at that?
Maybe we must be flexible. We must think about our mistake and discuss this mistake and fixate it, and understand that there are dynamics of process and cognitive framing too in dynamics. And because we don't must to give something punishment for our non-understanding early. It is good to understand now and to be ready, to be flexible in future. Just now and in future. I think it is the abstract frame, but concrete must be due in each situation, what we can do together.
Thank you very much, Lyubov. Next question is really about the part that Russian academics can play in this conflict. I know that there have been some calls for boycotts of Russian academics now, and I have to say that I don't agree with that at all. I've been in contact with a number of ECREA members over the past week who are Russian, based in Russia. And either they are doing their best to oppose the regime, or would do so if they weren't simply scared and frightened of being arrested. And so my personal opinion is that boycotts are very difficult. And the question from the floor is really about what pressure is being placed upon these Russian vice-chancellors who are supporting the regime actively, and is there any possibility for criticism, and is there any role, or is there any possibility for critical Russian academics to play a role in enlightening the Russian people about what's really going on?
If it's possible, I answer the first. I give the example of our communication about psychological association, because Ukrainian association, National Ukrainian Association of Psychologists, asked European Federation of Association to exclude the Russian association from European family. And we have a discussion with Russian academics, and our position is about responsibility. They must think about their responsibility, not about their fear or maybe something other, but about responsibility for their society. Because the first, for their society. For Ukrainian, it's really too need, but for the first for their society, because their work give the trauma their society, the trauma of destroy the reality, destroy the connection with the reality. And this is the fact for their responsibility. All intellectual community of the Russia. This is the point of our discussion with psychologists. But I think the communication with the Russian media workers and professors and universities is about responsibility too. Maybe other something added, but it is the first point of our thinking about.
Thank you very much. And I think there's a related question as well about how can...
John, we have a couple of other people who want to answer, if that's possible.
Yes,
Elisabeth, go first.
Thanks.
I have no suggestion or any good idea of what to do, but just a brief story from yesterday. In a different project, there are two researchers from very modern Russian university. One that I was rather thinking would see go downhill because it depends so much on foreign funding, and also the salaries can be good if people get A, foreign grants, and B, published in good international journals. But then what came yesterday, I found it deeply shocking. One of the two wrote to us that she didn't mention anything around the war. She talked about that family circumstances forced her to drop out. But it's very clear that before the vice chancellors felt any pressure, these vice chancellors very likely, or maybe they faced, well, not from the West, but they faced pressure or exerted pressure on their staff in what I would have thought the most unlikely university left in Russia would ever give in to that quickly.
Yeah, I would also add that I think, there's obviously been a lot of different reactions. And I think I would agree that it's thinking about responsibility, but it's also thinking about the scale, right? It's one thing to target, say, individual academics and to, either deprive them of possibilities to apply for funding or to exclude them from particular associations and things, and that obviously is one level. But the other level is, that on a systemic level, on the level of universities and rectors, we're not seeing any pushback. And the question of like, what are the pressures that are put on vice chancellors? They're part of the system. That's it's not about the pressures. It's they're part of the system that has been undermining Russian academia and Russian science for years. And so, like, I'm not surprised they're not speaking out, and I'm not surprised by this letter that Lyubov cited, which is horrifying, which basically says we subscribe to every lie that the Russian government and the Russian officials are currently promoting about Ukraine. But it is really, it's about thinking about the systemic supports, and like if the system is rotten, why should other external actors support the system? Why should they provide funding? Why should they provide collaboration? Why should they provide opportunities for such a system? But then it's also about the personal responsibility, of each individual person and about their circumstances, because we're saying, oh well, Russian academics or Russian citizens are afraid to speak out because they might risk arrest or losing their job. I mean, yes, but at the same time, if they know what's right and what's wrong. And Ukrainian academics are risking their lives, and they're risking losing not just their jobs or their livelihoods, but losing everything, right? So I think it's thinking about, it's difficult to compare things, but it's also very clear that like you can ask for, we can feel pity and we can feel disappointed that Russian academics aren't getting opportunities, but it's just impossible to compare that to what's happening to people in Ukraine. And for me, obviously, perhaps it's colored by the fact that I'm Ukrainian, but it's just very hard for me to feel pity for anybody in Russia at the moment, not because I understand that they're suffering, but so are we. And, you know, perhaps this isn't a politically correct position, but I just think, can we just for a second focus on Ukrainians and think about everything that's happening in Russia as a direct consequence of everything that Russia has been doing as a country, as a system, as a regime. And everybody was fine with it, you know. I mean, as we said, the war has been going on since 2014, and it's just now much more visible, and there are more visible consequences and more loss of life. But does that mean that up until February 24th, everything was fine and nobody was saying anything, right? So it's all about nuance, and I think both systemic issues and personal responsibility.
Thank you. So we have a question about how we communicate or try and communicate, or what the best way to communicate is with Russian civil society. I guess the concern here is that if the majority of Russians, as does seem to be the case, at least at the moment, support Putin and believe the Russian media, and then we have the sanctions and the impact and sanctions on top of that, then there may well be, rather than that precipitating opposition to Putin, it might precipitate greater militancy and greater Russian nationalism. It might actually produce something that it wasn't supposed to, in a sense. Is that a possibility? How do the sort of, so I guess the question is, what's the best way of countering Russian propaganda in Russia? Any thoughts on that? Joanna?
I mean, I'm not really sure I have a good answer to that question. I mean, I guess we're all kind of slow to put our hands up, but I mean, it's really, really hard. I mean, on an individual level, I've been sending text messages to, you know, the handful of Russians that I know that still, you know, didn't seem to get what was going on. And you know, on an individual level, there are ways to kind of, yeah, try and, you know, share images, just kind of try and talk to people, but on a sort of wider level, how to communicate with, I mean, the question was about Russians who don't get it, right? Rather than the Russian civil society that does understand and is protesting. I mean, I think that's what sanctions are for.
Putin supporters who would rather not support Putin, but would rather protest. How do we change their minds? Or who should change their minds? Or how could that possibly happen?
I mean, the sanctions are intended to change Russian minds, right? At every level, at kind of grassroots level, at elite level. I mean, the bigger almost issue is that even if, say, a majority of Russians realized that this war was a hideous mistake and can we not go back, you know, there's a question about whether that will make any difference politically, because the repressive machinery of the Russian state is very, very strong. I mean, I suspect in the coming year, however long this plays out, you know, we'll see that repressive machinery kind of tested to its limits. You know, if they're stretched in Ukraine, if they're stretched at home as people protest about, you know, the economic storm that's about to hit them. I mean, I honestly don't know how this will play out. I know that, you know, Russia doesn't have a history of changing politically from the bottom. It has a history of top-down change. I don't really know what's going on in the Kremlin, you know, what goes on inside the heads of the people who surround Putin. It looks like the economic elites have their doubts about this mess. It looks like the security elites are still, you know, firmly lined up behind the president. I mean, the only thing that the pathway that seems available is just to put on more and more pressure until the scale of the mistake becomes obvious to more people, not just, you know, at grassroots, not just in the general population, but at the top, because the only kind of more what you might call optimistic pathways out of this is a change of direction at the top in Russia. And I see sanctions as absolutely central to that as a communicative tool as much as anything. I don't know if that makes sense, but
yeah. Thank you very much. Now we have Lyubov.
One word. I think that the principle may be such: no privilege, no any privilege, but Russia blocks information for their people, and maybe it is very important to give possibility for open information space for people in Russia who want hear and see as possibility. Maybe it is technical answer, not the informational, but maybe cyber soft developer or any. But the possibility to make information, it is very important to give information from the Zaporebrik, from other countries, from other reality. Because if they have not information, it is the purpose of, it is the main goal of the Russia totalitarian country. I'm sorry, but we must give possibility, but no privilege, no joining, no. It is need for them to understand the responsibility and understand the reality.
Thanks very much. We now have a question really about Western representations of the conflict and the concept of Orientalism, I think, which is that perhaps certain media representations have been positive towards Ukrainians because they're seen by Western journalists to be similar, to be European, and there's a danger of othering Russians and seeing them as the barbaric other or the Oriental other. And there's also an issue perhaps in the concern for the victims of the invasion, Ukrainian victims of the invasion, hasn't been matched by Western media for the victims of other wars. In Yemen, in Syria, elsewhere. So I think there's a spectre of Orientalism and perhaps racism there on part of some of the Western representations of the media. See you nodding your head a little bit, Tanya. Does that mean that you?
Yeah, I mean, I think this also echoes that there's a later question in there from Bilge about, this kind of portrayal of Ukrainian refugees as people who are just like us, which obviously a lot of people have found problematic, right? Because again, that portrayal is as opposed to sort of say refugees from MENA countries and elsewhere. So I mean, I think it's definitely an interesting problem, right? We agree that it's a problem. I think I told somebody in an interview the other day that like Ukrainians are incredibly lucky that they are in Europe, because if they weren't, there's no guarantee that we would get this sort of attention in Western media or that we would get this sort of sympathy. And I think, it's important to acknowledge that. It's important to acknowledge that it's problematic. And it's also important to acknowledge how, as you say, countries such as the UK are sort of changing their perception of Eastern Europeans and how that gels with, their earlier framing of, these Eastern European people coming here stealing our jobs. I think this is something that Western media and Western establishment should reckon with, and they should understand why these changes are problematic. I'm not saying I'm upset about, you know, increased attention for Ukrainians and Ukrainian refugees. I think it's great, but I also think it points to how big that that rift is, and how previously problematic the bias was when we were talking about refugees maybe who come from a different country and who have a different skin color, and that somehow means that they have fewer rights. Like, that's not, you know, that shouldn't be the case. And so I completely understand, you know, the kind of horror and upset that this causes to, you know, people living in direct provision in Ireland who've been trying for years to be regularized here because they come from other conflict zones. Again, to the very, very difficult asylum processes across Europe, just, you know, the whole sort of migration crisis as it unfolded and starting in 2015 and before. So, you know, I think this is an opportunity for British media and for Western media to reckon with their biases, to try and understand why, you know, this is problematic, without necessarily saying, oh, we don't need to give Ukrainians this attention and this sympathy, but to understand that there are other people who are also deserving of very similar levels of attention, sympathy, and help, right? So perhaps, I hope also that, you know, Ukrainians, and I have definitely seen that Ukrainians that I've seen, they have sort of seized on this to say, well, you know, we really appreciate this attention, and we really appreciate the readiness with which the European Union and other countries have kind of made these changes to ensure that Ukrainian refugees can enter the countries. But it's also a problem because it means that somehow Ukrainians are more privileged in this than other people who have gone through very similar horrors of war and devastation.
Yeah,
I want to say that people are different. Refugees are different too, and it is reality. But I must to say, we apologize for the problem which we bring into Europe. It is our problem of our society, which we are deciding, but we not complete decided. And we bring this problem in your society. We apologize for them. We don't want, but it's really happening. We are different. But when in media, some bad part of reality marks as Ukrainian refugee, it is the instrument for informational attacks from Russia. It is reality too, because from these two sides, we must decide in each situation what we do. Understanding that reality is in informational war just now.
Okay, so we've got a question about
we have a few more reactions, John, perhaps to this question from Elisabeth and Precious.
Yeah.
Yeah, can I just briefly come in on this, because I think what Tanya was saying about this being an opportunity for, say, the British press to kind of rethink its approach to questions of refugees, for example, it's very interesting to see how it's been portrayed in the British media, which has been overwhelmingly positive responses to Ukrainian refugees, negative responses to the war, and very kind of sympathetic portrayals of what people are suffering and how we almost have a duty to help. And very highly critical of the UK government as well. You know, it's quite a common feature on the news that the UK government is not doing enough. It's making the visa application process too hard, and a level of sympathy for refugees we have not seen previously. I'm afraid I'm more sceptical about whether or not this marks an actual change in trajectory. I think, you know, the perceived whiteness of Ukrainian refugees is a big part of this. The fact they're being called refugees as opposed to migrants, which has not been the case in previous cases. I think it's very, very telling, and obviously helpful in terms of garnering some kind of public support behind a response, but kind of indicative of bigger social issues at our end, I think, unfortunately.
Does anyone else want to come in on that? Elisabeth?
I find it a tricky question with this, with the whiteness, around whiteness and exception of refugees. And I'm not sure whether that's not overblown in a way. If you think back to 2015, migrants influx into notoriously racist countries like Austria. It was a mass welcoming and a complete change for, of course, a few months till the racism returns, but it wasn't doing this kind of this sympathy and this co-suffering with their terrible fates. Did raise a lot of response. And I would also say, when we now look at Germany, it's something where history and closeness and space play a much bigger role right now, might change again, of course, than color. The people, when you listen to simple people responding to journalists on the streets, it's like almost like many on here, and from what I know from all my Russian, Ukrainian friends and acquaintances, it's like this shock. It's like they started thinking in terms of not 2022, but since the war, before the war, since the war started, and whatever kind of this frightening idea of after the war. And I would say that in Britain is a very different responses from people on the street. They're more worried in some interviews about the bills they will have to pay for heating than so much about the refugees. That might also be this kind of distance to it, together with not sharing a history and the big responsibility that, of course, made people more sensitive, as we do in Austria or Germans do. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so I'd like to wrap up there by giving a heartfelt thanks to all of our speakers, Precious, Tanya, Lyubov, Elisabeth and Joanna, for a really fascinating round table. And I realise how difficult it is to do your thinking on the hoof, as it were, in such emotional and also chaotic circumstances. So thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us, and thank you to all of the attendees as well. We're living through exceptional times at the moment, and ECREA, I'd just like to reiterate that ECREA stands by our Ukrainian colleagues, and I would encourage everyone to engage on an individual and an institutional level in supporting our Ukrainian colleagues as much as they possibly can. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.